What happens when Hollywood's most respected actor meets late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when decades of pent-up frustration finally erupt on live television. This is the story of how a single interview spiraled completely out of control, ending with security being called and a legendary actor walking off the set in disgust. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below, because you won't believe what happens when Denzel Washington finally says what everyone in Hollywood has been thinking about. Jimmy Kimmel. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live began like any other, but within minutes, viewers witnessed something entirely unprecedented. The tension was unmistakable from the moment Denzel Washington stepped onto the stage. There was something different about his usually calm and composed presence and edge, a tightly held frustration that seemed ready to boil over at any second. Kimmel, known for his provocative interviewing style and habit of pushing boundaries for cheap laughs, appeared completely unaware of the storm building right in front of him. As the interview got underway, what should have been routine promotional chatter for Washington's latest film quickly turned into something far more troubling. So, Denzel, you've been in this business for what, 40 years now? Kimmel began with his trademark smirk. Must be tough watching all these young actors come in and take roles that used to go to, more established performers. The remark lingered in the air like a loaded weapon. Washington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though his voice stayed measured. Jimmy, I think you're misunderstanding something fundamental about this industry. Talent doesn't come with an expiration date. Kimmel wasn't done. Leaning back in his chair with that familiar, condescending grin, he pressed on. Oh, come on, Denzel. We all know Hollywood has a shelf life even for the greats. I mean, when was your last really big hit? Training Day was what, over 20 years ago? The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the playful teasing they expected from a late-night talk show. It felt personal, deliberate, and needlessly cruel. Washington's publicist, watching from the green room, was already reaching for her phone. You know what's interesting, Jimmy? Washington said, his voice dropping into that dangerously calm tone anyone familiar with his films recognizes as the quiet before the storm. You sit here night after night, making jokes about people who've actually accomplished something with their lives. But what have you really contributed to the world besides cheap shots and manufactured controversy? The studio fell silent. Even Kimmel's usually dependable laugh tracks seemed to fail. His smile flickered for a brief moment before he doubled down, clearly unaware of how close he was to the edge. Pretty harsh coming from someone whose best days are clearly behind him, Kimmel fired back, his voice taking on that sharp edge that appears when his ego feels threatened. I mean, let's be honest, Denzel, you're not exactly lighting up the box office these days, are you? That was the moment everything changed. Washington slowly placed his hands on the arms of his chair and leaned forward. The controlled exterior began to fracture, and everyone in the studio felt a shift in the air. Years of watching Kimmel tear down people better than himself for laughs had finally pushed one of Hollywood's most dignified actors to his breaking point. You want to talk about lighting things on fire, Jimmy? Washington said, his voice still wrapped in velvet. Let's talk about how you've spent your entire career building yourself up by tearing others down. Let's talk about the real reason your ratings have been tanking. The camera operators exchanged anxious looks. This had gone far beyond anything they'd seen in years of tapings. Kimmel's producers frantically signaled from the sidelines, but the host was too consumed by his own arrogance to notice the warning signs. What happened next would change everything. No one in that studio was prepared for just how far this confrontation was about to go. Kimmel, either completely tone-deaf to the volatile situation he'd created, or intoxicated by his own sense of power, chose to escalate even further, leaning back with that insufferable smirk that had become his trademark. He delivered the line that would ignite the fuse. Oh, come on, Denzel. Don't get all serious now. This is supposed to be fun. Maybe you're just getting a little too sensitive in your old age." Kimmel's voice dripped with condescension as he waved his hand dismissively. "I mean, we're just having a conversation here. Can't handle a little friendly banter anymore." The audience felt the shift immediately. Even many of Kimmel's most devoted fans in the audience began to realize that their host had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Washington's eyes narrowed, and for the first time in decades of interviews, America's most respected actor looked genuinely angry. "Friendly banter," Washington repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that caused the entire studio to freeze. "Jimmy, there's nothing friendly about what you just said, and there's nothing friendly about the way you've behaved tonight." But Kimmel, seemingly blind to the seriousness of the moment, continued his attack. "Look, I get it. Nobody likes getting older. Nobody enjoys watching their relevance fade. But that's the business, right? Maybe it's time to accept that your moment has passed." The words struck the studio like a physical blow. Even the cameramen appeared uneasy behind their equipment. Washington's publicist was now desperately trying to catch the attention of the show's producers. But they seemed frozen, uncertain whether to step in or let the disaster continue for the sake of ratings. "My moment has passed," Washington repeated slowly, his voice dropping into the quiet intensity that had made him legendary. "On screen, Jimmy, my moment. I've been having moments for 4 decades. I've built a legacy that will outlast your entire career. What exactly is your legacy going to be?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Kimmel's face flushed red, his composure finally cracking under the weight of Washington's unbroken stare. His usual arsenal of cheap jokes and deflecting humor suddenly felt powerless against the raw honesty of the moment. "My legacy," Kimmel replied, his voice turning sharper as his mask of the cheerful host slipped completely. "My legacy is entertaining people for years while you've been making pretentious movies nobody watches anymore. At least I know my audience." That was when Washington stood up, not quickly, not theatrically, but with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who had reached the absolute limit of his patience. The studio audience audibly gasped. Even the band members stopped their casual tuning to watch what was unfolding. "Your audience," Washington said quietly, his voice carrying through the entire studio. "Jimmy, your audience is shrinking every single night because they're tired of watching you tear down people who are better than you. They're tired of your mean-spirited jokes and your complete lack of respect for anyone who's actually accomplished something meaningful." Kimmel's face was now completely red, his carefully crafted persona collapsing in real time. "You know what, Denzel? Maybe you should just stick to what you know making. Movies for the 3 people who still care about your career." The insult was so petty and so deliberately cruel that even Kimmel's own staff looked embarrassed. The audience had fallen completely silent, many of them staring down at their phones, visibly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Washington stepped closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence filling the space between them. "You want to know what I know, Jimmy?" he said. "I know you're a small, secure man who's built his entire career on making other people feel as miserable as you clearly are inside." The words sliced through the studio like a blade. Kimmel's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, utterly unprepared for this level of direct confrontation. His usual bag of tricks, the self-deprecating humor, the deflecting jokes, the fake vulnerability were useless against Washington's unflinching honesty. "You sit here every night," Washington continued, his voice growing stronger, "hiding behind your jokes, your writers, and your laugh track, thinking that makes you untouchable. But what you really are is a bully with a platform. And tonight, that platform just became your downfall." The tension in the room was suffocating. Kimmel's bandleader was frantically trying to get his attention, likely hoping to cut to commercial, but Kimmel seemed frozen, finally realizing he had pushed the wrong person too far. But Washington wasn't finished, not even close, and what he said next would ensure this confrontation would be remembered as the moment Jimmy Kimmel's career began its final descent. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Jimmy," Washington said, his voice carrying across the silent studio with absolute authority. "It's not that you're mean-spirited. It's not even that you lack talent. The real tragedy," Washington continued, "is that you were given a platform to do something meaningful, and instead you chose to use it to diminish others because it made you feel bigger." Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but Washington raised his hand. The gesture was so authoritative that even the host fell silent. The audience was transfixed, witnessing something they had never seen before: complete dismantling of everything Kimmel represented. "Every night, millions of people tune in to watch you. And what do you give them?" Washington went on. "Cheap shots at people who've dedicated their lives to their craft. Mockery of anyone who dares to take themselves seriously. You've turned cynicism into currency, and you've grown rich off other people's dignity." Cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of Kimmel's humiliation. His producers were now in full panic mode, torn between cutting away and realizing they were witnessing television history. Ratings would soar, even as the host's reputation collapsed in real time. Kimmel finally found his voice, but it emerged as a strained croak. "Hey, that's not fair, Denzel. I'm just doing comedy. People expect. They expect better," Washington thundered, cutting him off mid-sentence. "They expect better than watching you systematically tear down anyone who threatens your fragile ego. They expect better than your pathetic attempts to stay relevant by attacking people who've actually earned their place in this industry." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Even the usually supportive studio audience seemed to be holding its breath. Many now visibly uncomfortable with their host's behavior. Some were already reaching for their phones, clearly preparing to share what they were witnessing with the world. Kimmel's face drained from red to pale, sweat beading on his forehead as the gravity of the moment finally sank in. He tried to regain control, defaulting to his familiar dismissive arrogance, but his voice betrayed desperation. "Look, Denzel, maybe you should calm down a bit. You're making this way more dramatic than it needs to be. We're supposed to be having fun here." That was when Washington's composure finally shattered. The tightly restrained anger that had been building throughout the interview erupted. What followed would be replayed millions of times across social media. "Fun?" Washington's voice rose, making everyone in the studio flinch. "You think this is fun, Jimmy? You think destroying people's reputations for laughs is fun? You think turning careers into punchlines is entertainment?" He stepped even closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence now completely overwhelming. The host leaned back in his chair, visibly intimidated by the raw force of Washington's fury. "I've watched you for years," Washington continued, "sitting behind this desk like some kind of judge and jury, deciding who deserves respect and who doesn't. Let me tell you something about respect, Jimmy. You can't demand it. You can't fake it. And you certainly can't buy it with cheap laughs and manufactured controversy." Kimmel made one last desperate attempt to reclaim control of his show. Okay. I think maybe we should take a commercial break." "And no," Conton snapped, his voice cracking through the studio like a whip. "We're not taking a break. We're not cutting away. For once in your miserable career, you're going to sit there and listen to someone tell you the truth about who you really are." The audience was now completely silent, many of them visibly shaken by the intensity of the confrontation. This had gone far beyond anything they expected when they came to watch a late-night talk show taping. "You want to know what you are, Jimmy?" Washington continued, his voice dropping back into that dangerously calm tone. "You're a coward who hides behind writers, laugh tracks, and the safety of that little desk, taking shots at people who have the courage to put themselves out there and actually create something meaningful." Kimmel's hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of his desk. His usual smugness had vanished, replaced by something that looked unmistakably like fear. The man who had spent years making others squirm was now experiencing what it felt like to be on the receiving end. And the worst part, Washington said, leaning forward until he was nearly nose to nose with the shaken host, is that deep down, you know I'm right. You know, everything I've said tonight is the truth you've been running from your entire career. The studio had become a powder keg, and everyone could feel that they were seconds away from a total explosion. What Washington said next was the spark that finally ignited everything. You know what the saddest part of all this is, Jimmy? His voice had turned ice cold, each word delivered with sharp precision, like bullets. Somewhere along the way, you forgot that the people you mock, the careers you joke about, the dignity you tear apart for laughs, those belong to real human beings. People with real feelings and real families who have to sit at home and watch you tear them down night after night. Kimmel's face drained completely of color. His hands shook so badly he had to grip the desk just to steady himself. The cocky, arrogant host who had opened the interview was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he wanted nothing more than to disappear. I was just, Kimmel stammered, but Washington cut him off with a look sharp enough to melt steel. You were just, what? Washington demanded. Just doing your job. Just being funny. Just giving people what they want. His voice rose with each question as his anger finally broke loose. No, Jimmy. What you were really doing was feeding your own insecurities by making sure everyone else felt as small as you do inside. The audience was completely transfixed, watching their host's ego being dismantled in real time. Many had their phones out, recording what would almost certainly become the most viral moment in late-night television history. Kimmel made one final, desperate attempt to save himself. Look, Denzel, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. How about we start over? Clean slate. The laugh that escaped Washington was cold and bitter. Start over. A clean slate. Jimmy, you don't get a clean slate after spending years building your career on other people's pain. You don't get to reset when your cruelty finally catches up with you. Washington began moving toward the edge of the interview area, but he wasn't finished, not yet. The final blow was still coming, and everyone in the studio could feel it gathering like a storm on the horizon. For 20 years, I've watched you from a distance, Washington said, telling myself what you do doesn't matter, that it's just entertainment, just harmless fun. But tonight, sitting here and listening to you try to diminish me the same way you've diminished countless others, I finally understand what you really are. He turned back to Kimmel, his eyes burning with righteous fury. You're a parasite, Jimmy. You feed off other people's accomplishments, other people's failures, other people's humanity, because you don't have enough of your own to sustain a real career. Kimmel's mouth opened and closed without sound. The man who made his living with words had been rendered completely speechless by the brutal accuracy of Washington's assessment. And the worst part? Washington continued, his voice rising until it filled every corner of the studio, is that you've convinced yourself that tearing others down makes you important, that cruelty makes you clever, that destroying dignity is the same thing as creating comedy. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the band had stopped pretending to busy themselves with their instruments. Every eye in the studio was fixed on the two men at the center of this unprecedented confrontation. Then Kimmel made his final, fatal mistake. Whether it was desperation or one last pathetic attempt to regain control, it sealed his fate. You know what, Denzel? Kimmel said, his voice cracking. Maybe you're right. Maybe I am all those things. But at least I'm not a washed-up has-been clinging to past glory while the world moves on without him. The words hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds. Then Washington exploded. Underscore you, Jimmy. The words tore out of him with such force that several audience members actually jumped in their seats. Underscore you and your pathetic, miserable excuse for a career. The studio erupted into chaos. Audience members gasped. Producers shouted into their headsets. Camera operators frantically debated whether to keep filming or cut away. But Washington wasn't finished. "You want to call me washed up? You want to say I'm clinging to past glory?" His voice thundered across the studio, overpowering every other sound. "I have built something real, Jimmy. I have created art that will outlive both of us."